it's a group of German tanks. Don't look at them, Ivan. I don't want you to be influenced by the... Oh God, no! Ivan! During the early days of Operation Barbarossa, the Germans ran into a serious problem. Tanks like the BT-5 and the T-26 were quite easy to take out and didn't prove much of a threat. But things like the T-34, the KV-1 and the KV-2 were a completely different story. At that time, the best tanks that the Germans had were the Panzer III, which was armed with a short 5cm KWK-38 cannon, and in some cases they were still using the 3.7cm gun, and the Panzer IV, which wasn't much better, relying on a short-barreled 75mm gun designed to support infantry. The longer-barreled Panzer IV wouldn't show up until 1942. In short, the German tanks were not ready for this fight. Now early on, the Germans got kind of lucky. Many of the Soviet crews were poorly trained, inexperienced, or badly equipped. Seriously, there were some rare occasions where KV-2 crews were sent out with only ammunition for their machine guns and no ammunition for their main guns. Because of this, the German forces could often deal with the Soviet tanks using their towed anti-tank guns like the Pak-38. And it wasn't just the Eastern Front. In North Africa, the Germans were also running into heavier armed tanks like the Matilda II tanks, which proved to be quite difficult to knock out. Now, German command tried to react quickly to this, with projects like the Tiger I starting and the Panzer IV being upgunned. But all of this would take time and resources. Two things that the German army didn't have. So the question became simple. What do we have laying around and what can we build with it right now? And the answer is, surprisingly, Soviet guns. Yeah, it might sound strange, but a Soviet gun was at one point the most powerful anti-tank gun that Germany had. So in the first months of Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht captured around 1,000 Soviet 76.2mm F-22 guns. And the Germans liked these guns a lot. Once modified, these guns became one of the most powerful anti-tank guns that the German army had at the time. But they had a problem, they were heavy. Weighing over 1600 kilos, which is around 8000 Big Macs for my American audience, which made them, let's just say, not so much fun to move around. And this problem became even worse if the roads weren't great. And Russia is known for a lot of things, but good roads is not one of those. So already very early on, the Germans tried to mount these guns to any kind of vehicle to get just a bit more out of these guns. Now, the first attempt of this was in early August 1941, with the simple idea of mounting this Soviet gun on a half-track. Alcott was tasked with modifying the Sd.Kfz 6-3 half-track, building a superstructure on the back of it, which would house the Soviet gun. Now, according to the original plans, if this whole conversion would prove viable, 20 vehicles were to be constructed. However, in the end, only 9 were modified. Now, this vehicle is sometimes referred to as the Diana. However, this name is used for another vehicle. Instead, this had the very catchy name of FKR Ausführen 5T ZKJW. Yeah, that rolls right off the tongue. Now, somehow these modified half-tracks ended up in North Africa, which must have been a very fun logistical exercise. I mean, capturing guns and ammunition in the Soviet Union, sending them off to Germany to mount them onto the half-track, and then sending them off to Tripoli. A bit of an overkill of logistics, if you ask me. Anyway, all 9 of these got lost during combat pretty fast, and there was not much further information on these vehicles. There are some sources that say that 66 of these half-tracks were converted as field conversions with these guns. However, the proof of the existence of these 66 vehicles is a little bit vague, to say the least. Most of the times it comes with some pictures of these modified half-tracks that we were talking about before, with the superstructure, or some modified half-tracks with the German Pak-40 gun on there. However, this would just be the beginning of the use of the Soviet 76mm F-22 gun on German vehicles. By the end of 1941, the Germans saw that the time of the light tank was basically over. Even before the invasion of the Soviet Union, light tanks like the Panzer I and the Panzer II were struggling. By the time of Operation Barbarossa, the 2 machine guns on the Panzer I and the 20mm autocannon on the Panzer II was basically useless. But throwing away a useful chassis is also a bit of a waste. So a solution was proposed to remove the turret of the Panzer II and mount the German Pak-40 gun on it. Also, a little fun fact and a little side note, these turrets of the Panzer IIs weren't thrown away, they were reused. With most of these turrets being used in bunkers, particularly in the Atlantic Wall. Anyway, back to the Panzer II. These Panzer IIs were going to be converted into Marder IIs. This would effectively turn the outdated Panzer II into a Panzerjäger or a tank hunter. It would have an open-top design, would have thin armor, but an effective anti-tank gun. The first step of development of the Marder II began in May 1942, when Hitler was informed of the current state of the Panzer II and the possibility of using the tank chassis to produce an anti-tank vehicle. And it seemed like he liked the idea of the conversion of the Panzer II, so the green light was given for this project. Now, there were two variants of this vehicle. One with the German Pak-40 gun, which most people are familiar with. However, there was another variant that was using the Soviet F-22 gun. Now, interestingly enough, the variant with the Soviet gun was finished even before the version with the Pak-40 was approved, with the first prototype already being finished in April 1942. By that time, the F-22 gun was modified by the Germans. Things like the Soviet sight was replaced by a German telescopic sight, and it was even rechambered so that the gun could take the more powerful Pak-40 cartridge. It also got a new name, now being called the Pak-36R. Quickly going back onto the half track, it is unclear if it was still using the Soviet version, which used the Soviet ammunition, or if it was using the modified Pak-36R. Okay, back to the Marder II. The Panzer II chassis that were used also needed a whole set of modification just to squeeze in this gun, which created some interesting problems. For example, the vehicle could only carry 30 rounds of ammunition. The gun also had to be pushed back as far as physically possible, which meant that the space for the crew was incredibly cramped. Also, you needed to remove the whole gun if you wanted to get access to the engine, which was a fun little problem that probably made a lot of German mechanics doubt if frontline duty really was that bad at all.
Oh my god! Whoa!
Hello.
Then it got some other problems. For example, it became a really boxy and high vehicle, which made it very easy to be spotted and very hard to conceal. Still, in the end, it is not a bad vehicle if you think of it as being built out of junk that was still laying around. And it seemed like the Germans agreed with that statement, because the German army immediately ordered 150 of these tank destroyers. To build them, the army sent 62 Panzer IIs to Auket to convert them, with the rest of the chassis being newly built. Now, surprisingly, Auket's factory worked a lot faster than expected, and all 150 were finished by May 1942. By this time, the vehicle's name had already been changed a bunch of times, 4 times in 1942 alone, and it would change names 10 times over its lifetime, which made researching this vehicle very fun. Anyway, this first batch of Marder IIs performed surprisingly well, with some reports saying that it could reliably take out a KV-1 tank at a range of 1200 to 1400 meters. So with that success, a second batch was immediately ordered. However, this second batch was sent to a different factory and the results were a lot slower, with the factory taking a whole year to deliver these tanks. In the first year, the two factories combined made 194 Marder IIs. Out of these 194 Marder IIs that were built in 1942, almost all were gone within a year. In fact, by April 1943, there were only 16 still running. Most were destroyed or captured during the German defeat that winter, with many being captured at Stalingrad. We do know that one of these captured Marder IIs ended up in Kabinka for testing, which had to be fun for the Soviets, like, that gun looks very familiar. Oh well, time to test our own guns. Anyway, because there were so little left, in 1943 they barely saw combat anymore. However, by the end of the year, the numbers did rise a little bit, going from 16 to 20, only because of some repairs. And here comes the funny part. In late November 1943, the vehicle finally got its official name, the Marder II. So, yeah, again, very fun to research this vehicle. By the end of 1944, there were only 8 left. And by March 1945, there were only 6 that survived. Again, really not bad for something that was just put together. Anyway, if you thought that that was the end of the Soviet 76mm F-22 gun, well, you're wrong, because we have still one more vehicle to cover. Okay, so if the Marder II was a quick fix, the Marder III was Germany fully committing to the idea. Instead of recycling worn out Panzer II hulls for the tank, Germany moved to the Czech Panzer 38T chassis. Now, the Panzer 38T by 1941 also was a vehicle that was starting to show its age, but it was more reliable and better built than the Panzer II chassis. Now, yes, the Marder II and the Marder III looked very similar on paper. The Marder III would get the same Soviet F-22 gun, same open fighting compartment, same fin armor, and even the same limitations like only carrying 30 rounds of ammunition. But the more important thing was the vehicle underneath that was just much better. Another fun thing that the Marder II and the Marder III had in common was the Marder III had also a bunch of different names, which again, Made research a lot of fun. Here are all the names that this vehicle used. And I'm just gonna keep calling it the Marder 3. Well, but that's not the Marder 3, this is the Marder 3. Shut up, we'll get to there. Anyway, to save time, the Germans ordered the BMM factory to reuse the Panzer 38T production line for this new Marder 3. However, this came at a cost, with tank production being reduced. And by June 1942 it completely stopped and the factory completely focused on building the Marder 3. At the end, 344 Marder 3s were built with the Soviet gun. Now, most of these Marder 3s were sent off to the Eastern Front, but a third of them ended up in North Africa, where they went to fight the British and later even the American tanks. And in the desert they quickly discovered a problem. Heat tall. At long ranges the Marder 3 was easily detectable. Being so tall and without any cover, they stood out a lot. And with the thin armor, the British could easily take them out. In the open desert, Marder 3 units were often wiped out almost as fast as they would arrive. Luckily, on the Eastern Front with more cover, they performed a lot better. Again, this idea proved very successful, because even when the supply of Soviet guns ran dry, the Germans kept producing the Marder 3s, this time with the German 7.5cm Pak 40 gun. And yeah, when this vehicle got the new German gun, they had to do some redesigns of the vehicle, but that is beyond the scope of this video. Because, well, the Marder 2 and the Marder 3 with the Soviet guns weren't perfect by any means, it proved something very important. A smaller and lightly armored vehicle with a powerful gun could still dominate the battlefield. And the lessons learned from these vehicles directly led to vehicles that were much more deadly. Anyway, that is about all I have for you about these German tanks with these Soviet guns. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.